All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling something we literally hear about every single day: generational labels. I mean, whether it's millennials, boomers, or Gen Z, we are constantly talking about generations, right? But if you're kind of tired of the toxic stereotyping, the endless finger pointing, the whole okay boomer or Gen Z is lazy rhetoric, you are absolutely in the right place. Because today, we're going to look at why these labels actually exist in the first place and how we can use them as this incredibly powerful tool to understand each other rather than just judge each other.
Okay, let's dive into this. Whenever someone says, oh, that is such a Gen Z thing, our immediate instinct is usually to argue about whether the label is fair or not. But honestly, that is completely the wrong question to ask. The truly useful question here is, what is this label actually trying to describe? Because generational labels aren't meant to judge us. They're trying to show us the history that shaped us.
To really grasp this, we have to contrast two very different ideas. A lot of the time, we just assume generations are all about shared character, this totally false idea that your generation completely dictates your destiny or your fixed personality or that you fit perfectly into some neat little stereotype box. We need to scrap that idea entirely, just throw it out. Instead, generations are really all about shared context. It's about the historical backdrop, the systemic patterns you grew up inside of. It's not a personality type at all. It's the actual world you experienced when you first stepped into adulthood. To make this whole abstract concept a bit more concrete, think of a cohort label less like a personality test and, honestly, more like a label on a batch of fruit. Seriously, it tells you exactly when the fruit was picked, how it was stored, and the specific environmental conditions around it. But it absolutely does not mean every single piece of fruit is going to taste exactly the same. When we mix this up, we start using generations as this lazy shortcut for someone's entire moral compass or work ethic, and man, that just completely misses the point.
So moving right along, let's jump into Section 1, the rules of cohorts, and how these quote-unquote batches actually form.
Let's rapidly walk through the 5 irreducible truths of cohorts. Number 1, timing shapes experience. The state of the world you meet when you turn 18 or 22, that basically builds your default adult instincts. 2, shared conditions create shared habits. Now this doesn't mean identical choices, but it does mean similar starting postures. Number 3, labels explain patterns, not destinies. They're just one lens sitting right underneath your family background, your class, your personal experiences. 4, memory needs shorthand. As humans, we're pretty terrible at holding massive historical shifts in our working memory, so we use these labels to compress history just so we can actually talk about it. And finally, number 5, boundaries are absolutely fuzzy.
To really visualize what happens when those early habits are forming, imagine 2 people learning to sail. If you learn on a perfectly calm, well-marked lake, you naturally build a mental map that expects stability. You literally learn to trust the water. But if you learn out on the open ocean, shifting currents, sudden weather changes, you develop entirely different instincts. You're always alert to instability and danger. Years later, when these 2 sailors meet up at a yacht club, they aren't different species of people. They're just players who are trained under completely different historical conditions, bringing those unique instincts to the exact same table. And this brilliantly illustrates how our environments train us.
Which brings us back to those fuzzy boundaries we just mentioned. A genuinely beautiful analogy here is daylight fading into evening. There is no exact specific moment when day suddenly becomes night in a way that the universe just announces for everyone, right? There's no cosmic alarm bell ringing to say, hey, one generation just ended, the next one has begun. Real history flows smoothly. But just like we still use the word sunset because it's practically useful to help plan our day, we use these cohort boundaries to help orient ourselves in time.
All right, let's pivot a bit to Section 2, the context map, focusing on default worlds. We're going to sweep through the actual timeline here and look at the default worlds each group inherited.
Let's start off with the silent generation and the boomers. So the silent generation inherited a world heavily defined by severe scarcity and recovery right after the Great Depression and World War II. The core lesson their world taught wasn't move fast and break things. No, it was be careful, conserve, keep things together. And that naturally builds a default of restraint. Now, contrast that directly with the boomers. Their default world was completely defined by massive post-war expansion, economic growth, and unprecedented upward mobility. I mean, when the world keeps handing you stable ladders, housing booms, and expanding industries, you learn to trust institutions, and you confidently learn how to climb them. Then the timeline shifts again, bringing us to Generation X, an era defined by uncertainty, transition, and a healthy dose of skepticism. They grew up in a profoundly different landscape than the boomers did. We're talking intense economic shifts, gas shortages, and this rising divorce culture that fundamentally rewired family dynamics. Because their environment was so much less predictable, they learned really early on not to assume too much. They became incredibly self-reliant and pragmatic, mainly because they saw firsthand that the booming expansion of the previous era, it doesn't just last forever automatically. They realized they had to figure things out for themselves.
Next up, we arrive at the millennials. The defining context for this group is a mix of hyperconnection and intense instability. Millennials really act as this crucial, fascinating bridge generation. They grew up navigating this massive tension. They actually remember what an analog childhood felt like, but they had to transition into a heavily digital, always-on adulthood. And on top of that, they were pressured by the previous generations to be super ambitious, to get heavily educated, only to graduate directly into severe financial crises. So the economic payoff felt way less reliable than what they were originally promised.
Now, what's really interesting about Gen Z is this massive shift to total digital normality. See, Gen Z didn't adopt the internet the way older generations had to. For them, digital life was simply the environment they were born into. They don't marvel at the tool, they just seamlessly build their entire lives around it. They came of age in a world where constant disruption, hypervisibility through social media, and rapidly shifting global identities are literally just the standard normal. And honestly, this context makes them incredibly adaptable to constant instability, even if it does bring a whole new set of anxieties along with it.
Finally, looking at the kids of today, the emerging Generation Alpha, we're seeing an AI-native childhood. For them, there is even less friction. Technology isn't experienced as this separate tool you have to deliberately sit down and learn to use. It's seamlessly integrated into absolutely everything. It's practically the air they breathe. Their expectations are built entirely on background automation, extreme personalization, and this post-device thinking, where human and machine assistants are just constantly intertwined. It completely fundamentally changes their baseline for how fast any problem should be solved.
So what's actually driving these massive shifts between eras? Well, it all comes down to specific systemic forces. Think about it. When the economy shifts, it fundamentally changes an entire group's risk tolerance and sense of mobility. When technology leaps forward, it completely alters the speed of communication and access to info. Shifting institutions change our baseline trust and patience. Changing social norms literally redefine identity and family structure. And major crisis events dictate a generation's underlying fears and adaptability. This essentially proves that generational labels aren't just petty gossip. They are the very real forces of history, compressed into a shorthand we can easily talk about. All right, let's move to our final section. Section 3, Systems Thinking Beyond Stereotypes. Let's see how all this builds from a basic timeline into a highly empowered and frankly empathetic worldview.
Moving forward, whenever you hear a generational label, we really need to stop repeating the tired stereotypes. Instead, try becoming a historical translator by asking 3 simple questions. Number 1, what world did this group enter? 2, what pressures were common for them? And 3, what patterns might naturally follow from that? Doing this literally drops the confusion immediately. It stops us from jumping straight to judgment, and instead, it invites a genuinely wholesome understanding of where a person is actually coming from. Which brings us to a really crucial anchoring idea. Each generation learned what to expect from the world before it had the power to shape it. Seriously, let that sink in for a second. A generation is really just the story of how a group of people learned the rules of life from the specific version of the world they first encountered. So the crucial point is, this idea right here is the ultimate key to understanding each other without all that judgment.
Ultimately, generations are lenses for seeing history. They are not boxes people fit into. By keeping this lens honest, we stop overgeneralizing. And honestly, more importantly, this systems thinking approach helps us build real, tangible bridges. It helps us resolve misunderstandings in our families, in our politics, and every day in our workplaces. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Now that you know the default world they inherited, how will that change the way you interact with them today? The next time you find yourself getting frustrated by someone from a different generation, take a pause. Just ask yourself what version of the world trained their expectations. Thank you so much for exploring this with me on The Explainer today, and please keep using this incredible lens to see the world. Catch you next time.